So here's a classic rigging problem. That looks really bad, doesn't it? Right? Here's your classic like bad shoulder twist. The whole system we have for managing twist down the spline is actually really nice. So I'm going to turn on inherit twist, and what inherit twist does is to hold, like, basically it looks up the spline at the control, a control immediately before it, the joint immediately before it, and it figures out what twist it ought to have at this point in the spline from there. Oh, also you saw me just translate the thing and have everything work. That again falls out of the fact that this is a spline, and therefore if I move one of the CVs, it does spline things, right?
And you might want to just show twist down the spline too.
Yeah,
That's
actually,
a really
let me just like
rituals. And Jacob English is asking how do they twist? And
how do
that's
they
a good
twist?
question.
So they it has a bunch of internal, like that's something that the deformer does internally. So that's actually a really good point that I'm glad was brought up because it's something I didn't really talk about until now. But managing twist is another one. Like I was talking about stuff where it's like, oh, you have this big complicated system, and one of the reason why Contour is often very performant is that it takes a bunch of complicated systems that otherwise need to be in the node graph of your rig, and the deformer just does that. And twist is actually a really good example of that. So basically, each one of these joints, in addition to having a separate twist value, actually, the geometry's not going to support this, right? But
Right.
you can theoretically twist as much as you want, but it also has twists that it figures out from the world space rotation of any of these joints.
Yeah, so just to clarify that, there are a couple of types of twist that we have, and one of them just comes from the joints,
Right.
and it just naturally falls out of the joints. If you move the joints, you get twist. But there's basically you can and bone CVs are a little bit different from joints, and they don't by default add to the twist, but you can turn that on so that the bone CV's frame also controls twist.
Right, let me add some here.
It's an attribute on them. But there's also another attribute on each of these influences, not influences, but each of the CVs of the spline that layers additional twist on top of it. And so the natural twist of the joints can only go up to 180 degrees. But the twist that you can overlay onto it, you can, if you have the geometry to support it, you can add an arbitrary amount of twist, and it'll never candy wrapper if you have enough geometry. Now,
Right.
obviously, if you can add 720 degrees of twist, you're going to need a lot of geometry to support that. But it does mathematically fall out correctly when you do that.
Yep. Now here's one thing to just note here. So note that when I'm twisting this, you can see like a little, see that going on over there. Sometimes that doesn't really matter. What that's actually coming from is the fact that this twist is spline. And because we need the twist at a given joint, or a given CV, basically, to actually match the actual twist value that you actually have, right? That seems pretty important. As a result, we do essentially the equivalent of, it's a spline. When we do spline twist, that's a spline that interpolates its control points. What do they call that? It's not a... what's the technical term for that? Like when you have a spline that actually...
It's an interpolating
spline. It's an interpolating spline. Okay, yeah. But, of course...
It interpolates as a point.
Yeah, exactly. The consequence of an interpolating spline, as is always true, right? If you want it to be smooth, is overshoot. And so what you're seeing there, you don't see it, like, it's not always a problem, but, like, yeah, what you're seeing there is actually spline overshoot. And for a lot of characters, it actually doesn't matter that much, because you're not usually twisting these things purely in isolation. You've got a character that's really transforming its pose. But sometimes it isn't great to have it do that, and you have the linear option too. And linear actually often also produces perfectly good twisting. So it's not really necessary to use spline, and sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. It just sort of depends on what looks good. If you are ever encountering issues where the spline overshoot and the twist looks weird, like linear will solve that issue for you. And especially when you have a case here where you've got something where you're not, you have a relatively low res mesh. Like if one of the things that I should mention about this and about this mesh is that it is lower res. I mean, it's not ridiculously low res, but it's lower res than a lot of meshes that you see people doing with animation are. And that's, to an extent, a personal preference. There's a lot of things that I think lower res meshes are good for, not modeling wise, right? Like you don't sculpt a mesh at this resolution, you topo it at this resolution, but that has a variety of sort of nice effects. You don't need it to be this low. I mean, you can use rituals perfectly well with meshes of much higher density. But what it does do is it means that certain things, like the way that this is a linear twist, like work out fine, right? That helps to soften some of that stuff. Otherwise, you might lean on spline twist a little bit more. I mean, it's usually not really an issue either way.